Welcome back. The time is 8:42 Central African time, and we're going to be switching gears now to what's currently happening on the continent. Another grim chapter seems to have unfolded in Somalia's ongoing battle against violent insurgency. At least 20 lives lost and dozens more wounded after a suicide bomber targeted a military recruitment center in Mogadishu, a brutal reminder of al-Shabab's relentless grip on Somalia's fragile security landscape. And this comes just a day after the target killing of a senior army commander, raising renewed fears of militant infiltration and a growing instability across the Horn of Africa. And joining us from Namibia is Abdirizak Muhumed. Is a PhD research fellow at the Society, Work and Politics Institute at Wits University, and also an expert on governance and conflict in the Horn of Africa. And we'll be unpacking the significance of this latest attack, the deep-rooted insurgency problem in Somalia, and what this says about regional security efforts. Abdirizak, assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah so much for joining us. Welcome to Salam Media. Always a pleasure having you on.
My pleasure, Jenny. Thank you very much.
Pleasure's all ours. I think let's kickstart the conversation with this latest attack in Mogadishu. It's a familiar and yet devastating pattern. But the question is, this time around, this particular attack, what does it tell us about al-Shabab's current capacity and strategy when it comes to Somalia and maybe the rest of the region in the Horn of Africa?
Yeah, I think it tells us al-Shabab's determination in one way, and at the same time, its weakness. As you are aware, in the last 3 years, there has been a huge pressure on al-Shabab. Somalia waged a kind of offensive that has not been presented against al-Shabab. Somali forces, with the help of the African Union peacekeeping mission in Somalia and the rest of the world, greatly damaged al-Shabab's bases. Some of their bases were recaptured, and there has been an ongoing battle. So that, I think, put a lot of pressure on al-Shabab, and the current attack was a way of al-Shabab saying, we are still here, we can still strike at the heart of Mogadishu, we can still conduct suicide bombing and cause shocking scenes and terror as has been the case. So in one way, it tells us al-Shabab is still determined. It's still a security threat to Somalia's governance, or at least the struggling government now. And at the same time, it also indicates that they are not holding that much in the front. Therefore, they are retreating back to Mogadishu now, resorting back to their usual tactics of targeting civilians or crowded areas. And this particular target was on a military recruitment where young men who were interested in joining the army were lining up for recruitment.
Very, very concerning. You mentioned that there's been an overwhelming support to Somalia when it comes to al-Shabab historically. You mentioned that the AU and the UN peacekeeping forces have been on the ground, but despite international support and years of counterinsurgency efforts, if I can put it that way, we keep seeing these breaches at military installations. Where would you say the security gaps are, and why do they persist?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the tragedy of Somalia's current ongoing state building and recovery is that the country has not been able to build a strong national army force. And that's where the weakness is. That's where the insecurity is. So Somalia is not in control of its territory as a country. And there is also another political problem that also adds to this insecurity, and that's mainly is the political division within Somalia. So there is a federal state and there are federal member states. And some of the federal member states and the federal government are not politically or militarily or in terms of security collaborating as they should be. So those are the loopholes. So there is, even though there has been a lot of attempt to build a Somalian national army, training to taking the Somali members of the military for training outside of Somalia has been going on for the last 20 years. But still, the country has not managed to put a very strong national force that secures the whole country. So al-Shabab still rules a large swathe of the country. There are huge land that the government is not in control, a huge land that the federal member states, especially in the southern part of the country, are still in the hands of al-Shabab. Economy, that aspect of the economy in terms of either war economy or the political economy of the conflict. So all of that is in favor of al-Shabab. So where the security gap really is that all these international peacekeepers cannot fully bring the country under their control, and there are no Somali national army that's fully in control of the country. So mainly the government, federal government that is in Mogadishu is waging an offense against al-Shabab. But al-Shabab, is quite mobile. They know the terrain. They have rule in the rural areas. So they still have, by force, a large number of the public that is still under their control. So that's where the loophole is.
I want to focus on that, the capacity of the Somali army, because there's often talk of the African Union mission in Somali, or the African Union transition mission in Somali withdrawing from the country, and Somali forces taking over full security. In light of these attacks, and when we look at the capacity of the Somali forces, is the transition realistic or dangerously premature, if I can put it that way?
No, it is. I think the idea of withdrawal has been put to stop. It is no longer. It's only that, remember, it was initially AMISOM, then ATMIS, the AU forces. Yeah. Then now it's another remodel kind of peacekeeping. This time round, countries that were not previously part of the contributing part of the troop contributing countries that were not previously part of the troop contributing countries are now invited. Egypt is now included, which has not been part of that. So the withdrawal as planned is not moving forward. It has not been realistic in the first place. And I think the Somali government now realized that it's not realistic, and they don't have a Somali national army that's now that can replace bases that the international peacekeeping troops were supposed to relocate in case of withdrawal. So I think the whole mission is now remolded, but there is a great challenge in terms of finance. So in terms of funding, so if you remember, all these missions are mainly funded not by the African Union or the African countries mainly. The African countries might have the troops, but they don't have the fund. So Trump now in America, and with that kind of downgrading the aid for security and for other purposes and for peacekeeping. So the fund is slightly, there's kind of a frustration whether that funds will be secured. So it is a whole lot of another chapter unfolding now in terms of Somalia's security or in terms of fighting al-Shabab. So a lot will depend on whether funding will be available for the expected remolding of rearranging of the peacekeepers.
Mm, mm, mm. And speaking of funds, we often hear that al-Shabaab offers services, from tax collection to judicial rulings in areas that it controls. How do we now, counter an insurgency that in some places seems more functional and more visible more than the state itself?
But that's a great point, and I think that's where the predicament of the state in Somalia lies, and mainly because the government has not been able to offer an alternative to al-Shabaab in terms of governance.
Mm.
In a number of areas, al-Shabaab might be brutal in terms of resorting to suicide bombing and in terms of killing civilians, but in the areas they rule, they have the monopoly of violence. In other words, no any other actor can commit an act of violence or crime. So and and the SAFs, they don't offer actually a SAFs delivery in terms of the kind of governmental SAFs, but people are here in need of peace, and that is often seen as itself a SAFs. If the government cannot offer you, there were, for example, there were areas, districts that the government captured from al-Shabaab, but because of the government's inability to provide SAFs to the people, connect the public to the governance. So there is a great disconnection between the process of state building and the government and the Somali public that mainly living, or the Somali population that's mainly living outside of, let us say, Mogadishu, for example, the capital city. So al-Shabaab has grown mainly in the absence of government, and it might get stronger, not because al-Shabaab is strong now, but because of the weakness of the government in terms of not being able to provide services to the people, not being able to connect the governance to the people. So that is actually where the main problem is. There is that disconnection between the public and the government, and in between Shabab comes. So in the areas the government is, the government may not even have a full monopoly of violence, so other actors might disrupt peace. But in the areas that are under al-Shabaab, it's only al-Shabaab that can do whatever it wants.
Mm. Mm. Very,
Yeah,
very concerning.
so you are right
Very
in that
concerning.
sense. You are right in that sense. So many people now see, in fact, there's even some people will argue al-Shabaab is even a better alternative in terms of governance. So there's even that debate because of the governance weakness in Somalia.
And that's where I think it gets really, really concerning. Abdirizak, before I let you go, do you see signs of international fatigue when it comes to Somalia, whether it's in the continent or just worldwide? And finally, what risk does that pose? And also, what fundamental change, I think, do we need right now, whether politically, militarily, or socially, if Somalia is ever to break out of this insurgency cycle?
Oh yeah, you are right. The science has been on the wall in terms of the of the fatigueness of the, particularly the donor communities, or the West, that has been pushing at least for Somalia's recovery and trying to bring back a state in a post-conflict Somalia. So there is that element of fatigueness, and I think most of the governments communicated that. Most of the donors, particularly the European Union, the Americans, they communicate their frustration to the Somali government. And can you have been saying, hey, can you put your acts in order? We are no longer able to, for example, fund you. We are not able to militarily, even in terms of funds and other equipments, fight al-Shabaab. So So the problem is that the whole governance structure is in a way paralyzed. It has not been moving forward for the last 20 years. So I think there will be a time, I think the international community, even though the fear of al-Shabaab taking over Somalia keeps them at least going, or in terms of or motivates them in terms of providing aid to the existing structures of governance in Somalia. But I think there will be a time, if things do not improve, that the international community might say we can no longer do this. In terms of the African continent, I think that, you see, there is also here an interest for the troop contributing countries. So they are paid back when they bring troops back. So if they don't get the money from the international community, so the African countries also will take back their troops and say, hey, we can no longer die without getting back what was pledged to us in terms of funds. So the risk is quite high if the Somali political elite do not compromise and at least politically reach a consensus in a way that can move Somalia forward. Otherwise, both the risk and the fatigue are on the wall.
I think we're going to leave it on that note. Thank you so much, Abdirizak Muhumed, coming to us live from Nairobi. Really appreciate you giving us your time. And yeah, appreciate your insights as well when it comes to the issues of the Horn of Africa.
Thank you. Thank you.
There you go. That was Abdirizak Muhumed, a PhD research fellow at Society Work and Politics Institute at Wits University, and also a lead research in governance and conflict in the Horn of Africa. And yeah, as Somalia mourns yet, I think, another devastating suicide attack, the grim reality remains. The war against al-Shabab is far from over. I think it's been plus minus 20 years since this insurgency has withstood regional offensives and international interventions and internal reforms. And despite some of these progress, the path to lasting peace in Somalia and indeed across the Horn of Africa remains long, remains complex and fraught with setbacks. And I think as the ATMIS prepares to exit and Somalia prepares to stand on its own, with its fragilities, with its failures, with its, just holes in all of his systems. The question is no longer, I think, just about defeating al-Shabaab, but about building a state resilient enough to keep them from returning. And only time will tell whether the future is within reach. And that future can only be reached if the Somalian government becomes a government. You can't have a situation where an insurgency, a terror organization, well, a classified terror organization, become an alternative to a democratically elected government that has all the resources of the state in its capacity and at its disposal. So yeah, that's really sad, and condolences to all of the 20 plus that have lost their lives in the suicide bombing. But I think, man, Africa needs to wake up, man. Can't be dealing with al-Shabaab 20 years later. What are you not getting right? As Somalia. What's wrong? You can engage with us. I think as Somalia continues its years-long battle against al-Shabaab, you can engage with us. How long do you think a country can fight the same war before the world and its own people begin to lose hope? And most importantly, what will it take to turn the tide for good in Somalia? And for the rest of the Horn of Africa, because I don't think it's only Somalia that's struggling with insurgency and just general instability in the country. I mean, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia. There's just a lot that's happening in the Horn of Africa, and it's such a strategic region on the continent that it needs to work. It needs to work. It's been going on for way too long. That region of the continent has been unstable. And again, for Africa to work, it's little regions like this. You start in SADC, you go to the western part of the continent, and then the Horn of Africa, in the upper eastern part of the continent, Central Africa, West, East Africa, North Africa. It's little regions. When you start having little regions on the continent work and function, ultimately you're going to have peace, stability, and growth on the continent. So you kind of have a SADC, which is doing okay, and West Africa, which is also considerably stable, but then you have the rest of the continent looking the way that it does. It just baffles the growth of the continent, and it's concerning. Let's start regionally. Start working on the regions, and maybe, just maybe, Africa could start being a global powerhouse that it deserves to be, and that all of us can agree that it should be. I think maybe that should be the key, note as we wrap up Africa Month. Africa, being a big elephant that it is, sorting itself piece by piece, and ultimately the whole chunk of it will start working. You can engage with us. What do you think? What do you think needs to work in Somalia, and ultimately for the rest of the continent, to find peace, to get some kind of stability and economic growth? You can engage with us. Our studio line is 011 680 on WhatsApp is 061 and on all our social media platforms you can search Salam Media. The hashtag of the show is hashtag news and views, and we can get the conversation going. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with you right after this.